Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's September 20th, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host. You can send us your questions and comments to questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them in the chat room. Helga, following a series of international conferences over the last weeks, beginning with the BRICS Summit, the G20, the G77, the Eastern Economic Forum, among others, the focus of attention has now shifted to the United Nations General Assembly opening in New York. And there are sharp differences which have emerged between the nations of the Global South and those of the so-called Global North, with the leaders of the Global South insisting that their voices be heard, especially on questions that pertain to the end of the colonial order, and those in the Global North who are still stubbornly committed to a so-called rules-based order. Among the speeches yesterday we heard from Presidents Lula of Brazil, Ramaphosa of South Africa, and Fernandez of Argentina. But also yesterday, the speeches included one from President Biden and President Zelensky, both of whom insisted on maintaining the flow of arms to Ukraine and the war against Russia. I'd like to begin with your comments on yesterday's session and where you see things heading over the next days and weeks, including the International Day of Peace at the United Nations tomorrow.
Well, I think that International Day of Peace is very urgent and very timely because the war danger is clearly rising. I mean, the whole discussion to have the Taurus cruise missiles being delivered or supposed to be delivered by Germany, then the F-35, these are nuclear capable stealth bombers coming from the United States, and pilots from East European countries supposed to be trained on these planes, which will take a while, but nevertheless, that clearly is, and that argument has been made by several military experts, that raises the level of danger of a Europeanization of the war. And once you are in, an expansion of war, then I'm quite certain that there is no limit, at least the danger of a global nuclear war. So that's the Damocles sword, so to speak, hanging over this UN General Assembly. And I think that the UN General Assembly is the one unique body which should take up the question of war and peace. This has been done implicitly or, to a certain extent by some of the speakers from the countries of the Global South. But I think it must be made even more dramatic and more urgent, because where else than then in the UN General Assembly should this issue be raised, which addresses the existence of mankind as a whole. As you said, the contrast between the speeches was very significant. You have the attempt to keep the rules-based order, which is not so ruly, it's not so democratic, it's not so transparent either, because nobody knows what these rules are, because they tend to change according to the circumstances as it fits the countries of the Global North. Where should these things be addressed if not in the United Nations Assembly? And the country leaders from the Brazil, South Africa, Argentina, and also many others. I didn't have time to listen to all of them, but there were several other speakers from Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Iran, and they were more or less all, not all of them, but several of them were really extremely outspoken about the injustices of the present world system and the need to change it. And then you have the idea of reforming the United Nations coming from the US and some other EU countries. And what they want to do is they want not the rightful demand by the countries of the global south to have a larger voice, because they Africa, Latin America, Asia, they are the vast majority of the human population, and they are not represented in a proportional way. So they want to have that changed, but the leaders of the global north basically want to change the UN Security Council to eliminate the veto power of the present 5 permanent members. Naturally, that should target the right of China and Russia to basically veto any decision. So that's a huge battle. And if you would now go for a majority rule in the UN Security Council, then there is no more place, where the buck stops, so to speak. So I think that the developments which we have seen, which you mentioned, the Johannesburg meeting, the St. Petersburg Russia-Africa meeting, the Jakarta ASEAN meeting, the G77, and finally the Vladivostok meeting, the East Economic Forum. This was a very rapid series of huge conferences where the New World Economic Order is being discussed. And, I can only say that once you look at these conferences in detail, it is absolutely breathtaking. And I want to, just pick out the Vladivostok conference, which was addressed by President Putin and, many others as well. But this is a huge development. I mean, Putin said that the development of the Far East of Russia will be the priority of Russia for the entire 21st century, that all the raw materials the world needs for a very long time to come are in Russia. Only 35% of those have been explored. So huge investments are occurring. There are already 2,800 projects which have been named, and almost 700 of them have already started. So this is a tremendous development potential, and the West is completely stupid if they don't take a positive attitude of cooperation. I mean, obviously, behind those people who wage the war against Russia is the idea to cut Russia into 10 or 12 different pieces, with the idea that then these raw materials would be accessible to the cartels. And, if you had no more a patriotic Russian government, which would defend that sovereign right of Russia to explore all of these raw materials for their own benefit, then naturally, you would really subdue also that part of the world under the rule of the present neoliberal system, which we have seen what it did. The fact that the BRICS countries are now rising in such an incredibly fast way has not been the evil doing of Russian trolls or the imperial desires of China, or whatever the Western medias are saying, but it is the fact that this present neoliberal world order did not and does not function, because it did increase the gap between rich and poor in the world everywhere, to the detriment of the vast majority of the world population. So it's quite natural that a counter movement is developing. So I think, I'm sort of mixed. On the one side, it's excellent that the idea of a new world economic order is getting closer and closer, and you can see that, there is an incredible optimism coming from the leaders of the global south. For example, President Lula in his presentation, expressed an unchangeable belief in the beauty of mankind. He expressed it a little bit different, but the basic idea, a tremendous optimism, and he denounced pessimism and indifference. He said that people should be indignated, about the poverty in the world, and should be motivated to fight it. And that's exactly what I feel also, that if people look at the huge problems of many parts of the world, they should have a passion to want to help to overcome that. But on the other side, naturally, so, I'm halfway extremely happy, but on the other side, the danger of the escalation of the war is also very present. So it's sort of like a hot and cold bath at the same time. And I think that can only be resolved if we organize enough people to really say we need a reorganization of this totally bankrupt transatlantic system, and we should cooperate with the countries of the global south. Only then this conflict will be resolved.
We have several questions related to the United Nations session. I'll try to get through them quickly because we also have a couple of philosophical questions for you. But from Canada, someone wrote, UN Secretary General Guterres, in his talk, said that the current financial architecture is dysfunctional, outdated, and unjust and needs reform. So the person wrote, is this a response to the BRICS and the Global South? Will it go anywhere, or is it just more rhetoric?
Well, I'm not privileged to have talked to Mr. Guterres, so I don't want to make a judgment. I think what he definitely responds to is the clear desire of all of these countries. The BRICS, there are 11 countries, about 40 countries have applied or are in the process of applying for membership. The G77, I think there are now 130 countries they just met. They have expressed such a desire. And, I think that it is in the air. Now, what is the correct form? There is obviously the new development bank, which has been, upgraded by President Lula. Former President Dilma Rousseff is the new president of it. She's an experienced, excellent person. And Lula has said that the new development bank has the potential of becoming the great bank of the global south. Now, we are circulating right now the writing of my late husband, the International Development Bank, because, he proposed that already in 1975. And this was very much a subject of discussion in the non-aligned movement. They even, basically adopted it in their final resolution of the Colombo Conference in 1976, 1 year later. So it has been in the discussion. And if you compare this IDB proposal with all the existing writings, it is the best, clearest conceptual document of how to do such a thing, how to create a new credit mechanism for development. So I can only advise you, get a copy, study it, circulate it, and then naturally, we have my late husband also proposed 4 laws of how to reorganize the bankrupt financial system, the 4 laws of LaRouche, and I have incorporated these 4 laws in the 10 principles for a new development and security architecture, because I think it does require to take into account global problems, and I have tried to express that in these 10 principles. So get equipped with all of these papers, read them and study them, because this is what will define the future. And we are at this point, tomorrow we have a rally in front of the United Nations at the UN Plaza. We will have a beautiful concert. We are distributing a lot of literature. We're trying to influence the environment of the United Nations. So one can only hope that, these ideas will affect the discussion. I'm sure that there are also some proposals to water it down, like, Biden has now proposed some counter to the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, this is very late. Like the Global Gateway proposal of the EU as a counter again to the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm not worried about these things, because either these people get serious and then they study the principles of physical economy laid out by LaRouche, or as the Chinese are realizing them to a very large extent, then they can accomplish something. If they stay with their present ways, There's nothing to worry. Look at what happens with infrastructure in the United States. Nothing. Look at what happens with infrastructure in Germany. They need 10 years to repair a silly bridge, between two cities over the Rhine. 10 years and it's still not finished. So I'm not worried about these grandiose counter concepts about, containing the Belt and Road Initiative, because the neoliberal economic theory, they have just lost it. They have lost the knowledge of how to do things. So let them make these speeches. I think they need to shape up and really get serious. I have not yet seen a sign of that.
We're speaking with Helga Zepp-LaRouche from the Schiller Institute. She mentioned her 10 principles, 10 fundamental principles. You can get that at the schillerinstitute.com website. This has been circulated widely, and I think it's a crucial document for our viewers to look at. Now, Helga, I do have a question from Maria Janicki from Buffalo, New York, who obviously is concerned about the current state of the United Nations. She asks, what do you think of world federalism as a mechanism to enact your plan? Replace the UN Security Council to allow all nations to have a say, draft jointly written laws, give up the right to war, create a common global security. It has some of the ideas that you said, but do you have any comment about that?
Well, that's a tricky question because, there were made in history several attempts to have such forms of federalism. I think, rather than discussing the specific predicates of it, I think more important is to really get serious on the economic principles, the New World Economic Order, the absolute need to overcome poverty and get a new health system, new education system, new credit system, infrastructure for all the continents. Get a clear sense of the physical requirements of a new world economic order. And then equally important, one has to be clear about the philosophical principles, because if it's just a formal arrangement, it does not work. That's why the present United Nations, while it is important and it's the only existing body, and the UN Charter is extremely valuable and must remain, nevertheless, what the UN is lacking is what I would call epistemological underpinning, and that's what I have tried to express in the last three principles of the 10. How to basically have a philosophical idea where conflicts can be resolved, and how you have a correspondence between what people do and the deeper lawfulness of the physical universe, and naturally a conception of man. So I think that needs to be urgently discussed, and I would encourage people, write back to us, write to this webcast, write to our publications, and engage in a dialogue, because I would like to encourage conferences, Zoom conferences, physical conferences. For example, one could have Zoom conference on the issue, on each of the 10 points, and have an in-depth discussion. One could have conferences among think tanks, among universities, among groups of countries, but we need to have a much more serious discussion. When clearly the existence of mankind is at stake, we must sit down and find the wise people of every country and enter a dialogue. How should we create conditions so that we can self-govern affairs on the planet without the danger of blowing ourselves up in a nuclear war? And that debate, in my view, is extremely urgent. So, let's just think of how we can encourage these institutions to do that.
Well, here's a question for you on precisely that philosophical nature. Bruno Romano from Rome writes that in his reading, LaRouche states that to gain knowledge of a higher order depends on access of the coincidentia oppositorum. This is indispensable for solving problems that otherwise remain unsolved by conflict with each other. And he goes on to say that LaRouche says only a small percentage, you have to have a percentage of people with this ability to create a winning society or nation. He said, the idea that the mind can be trained to open up to this higher level is absolutely revolutionary to me. And then he asks, excuse me, paper's stuck here. Then he asks if you have further suggestions on how to educate the mind in this direction and how to invite leaders of society to join this initiative to implement their personal capacity of judgment.
Well, I think that's a very good question because, the problem is that the present intellectual level, as it is attempted to be influenced by the mass media, the entertainment industry, the conscious effort to ruin theater and opera by something which is called in German Regietheater. Harley, if you know the English translation of that, you should help me out. It's the idea that, you destroy everything with modernisms, with arbitrary, alienation effects, just to break the concentration of the audience not being able to absorb the messages of great art, be it in music, poetry, or drama. So, you have a population which is really dumbed down. I mean, if you compare the intellectual level of people today, the average people, with that of, let's say, 30, 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, it is clearly going down, down, down. And it has everything to do with the fact that, for example, in Europe, with the education reforms which were made by the OECD in 1970, where they consciously threw out what they called the Bildungsballast, the burden of education of 2,500 years, saying, Plato, who needs that? Beethoven, who needs that? Let's all throw it out. So as a consequence, the curricula, whatever, of both the universities and schools was really reduced. It's much more sociology, it's much more comparable studies, but no longer going back to the sources, going back to the original discoveries. This was the humanist principle of Humboldt's system, for example. So as a result, people are generally more stupid. If you look at the average politician, let it be in the United States or in Europe, what do they know about the great classical culture of Europe? Have you ever heard them talking about that? I really have not met anybody in the present political leadership in Europe or Germany or the United States who would be knowledgeable of the Greek classics, the Italian Renaissance, the French Polytechnique, the German classical period, the Chinese Song period, the Indian Gupta period, the Abbasid Renaissance in the Arab world. These were, things which used to be common knowledge of the people. For example, if you look at the poems of Friedrich Schiller, which are beautiful, he created something very specific, which is called thought poetry, sort of a mixture between poetry and philosophy. And there, in these poems, which are wonderful, he has normally references, metaphors to specific cultural backgrounds, which nowadays people have no inkling anymore what that means. So they don't understand it anymore. So what is required, in my view, is, first of all, people would have to recognize that, and the best of, the political leadership, they should not be ashamed to say, okay, we have to read the dialogues of Plato. read the writings of Nicolaus of Cues, study Leibniz, study the great scientists and philosophers of 2,500 years of European history, and then take some of the other ones from other cultures like Confucius or Tagore from India or other great thinkers, take them into your repertoire and study it so that you have a universal judgment. And naturally classical music is indispensable because the difference between classical music and, let's say, pop music is one is addressing the creative faculties, because it forces the mind and the ears and sense perception of the music to conceptualize what Furtwängler called between the notes. Or in poetry or drama, if it's written, lyrical poetry or drama which has a classical conception, it forces the mind to think above the prose, to conceptualize the message which is above the simple words. And that kind of training of the mind is absolutely crucial. And it happens to be the same kind of thinking like the coincidence of opposites, that the mind can conceptualize always the higher one. And without that, you get stuck into controversy, my opinion is as good as your opinion. And then people quarrel to no end and nothing functions. So I think this classical training is really important. There is a master of it. That's my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche. He fortunately has written an enormous works. So you should go to the LaRouche library, which is online. You can also go to the website of the Schiller Institute or the LaRouche pub. You find all the articles, a lot of articles archived. Read this. This is what you need more than your breakfast, dinner, and lunch.
We also have an appeal that musicians and artists and others can sign as part of the movement for the International Peace Conference. Helga, I want to stay at this philosophical level. There are many other questions, and for those of you who sent them in, I'm sorry we won't get to a lot of them. I mean, questions like, will the Congress vote more money for Kiev? Things of that sort. But I think this is a question just directly follows from what you were just talking about from Thomas Blumstein. He asks, will it require many years of experience in the field of classical composition of music, poetry, and art to understand these higher principles? And he says, because it's not very common in our society today, except for a few here and there who are trained in this field. And he goes on to say, the good thing is that China has begun to make the classical tradition of Chinese history and culture more accessible. And the Russian president talks quite a bit about this in his speech at Vladivostok. So what do you think? Does it require many years to transform the education system to achieve this level of classical culture?
Yes, in one sense it does, because these are these are ideas which have some depths, and there are a lot of them, and there's a structure to them, and it's not something you can fake. But on the other side, the good news about it is that the human mind is capable of ordering principles, so that you don't go about it like an Aristotelian who would say, I have to have the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, and I have to learn all of that, like preparing for a quiz show, where you have to be prepared to answer the most idiotic question to become a millionaire. As a matter of fact, the Chinese government has eliminated quiz shows because it gives people a wrong idea of what knowledge is. And I think this is very smart, because true knowledge comes from love. Something you don't love, you don't want to know. Because if you love something, then you will be absolutely passionately trying to find out what is it what you don't know. Like some people love physics, and then they will study an enormous amount until they really have a grasp of it. Others like biology, then they do all kinds of experiments plants. They try to cross seeds. They have a little garden trying to experiment. They put their heart in it. And, once you put your heart in it, you will see that wonders open up. And, it goes very quickly. And then it's like, Herbert and Riemann, they talked about Geistesmassen. Geistesmassen being basically thought objects or ideas. So you conquer one idea, let's say in the field of mathematics or physics or philosophy or poetry, and then you add these Geistesmassen and they follow a certain order in your mind. And each time you add a new such Geistesmasse, thought object or idea, they resonate with all others. And the more you put into your mind, the more you will recognize that the mind recognizes similarities in one field from another field, and all of it becomes all of a sudden more orderly and more accessible. So it is, once you plunge in and say, look, mankind is in a terrible crisis, I have to know everything about physical economy because I have to be one of the people who know how to remedy this economy. And then you start reading, you start maybe with LaRouche, then you go to Leibniz because LaRouche was influenced by Leibniz, then you go to Friedrich List, then you look at Henry C. Carey, Count Witte. All of a sudden you have already the whole area of physical economy as a basic foundation. Then you go to the next subject. With other words, you have to start and you have to do what people like Schiller did. You have to have a life plan, what you want to conquer. Take a piece of paper or your laptop or whatever, write down what are the areas you absolutely want to conquer, and then start with them. And then after 1 month or half a year, you revise the plan because you have now a much better idea of what you should be looking for. Because as Nicolaus of Cruz said, you need a prescience of what to look for. Because otherwise, that's the problem with a lot of people who are flooded with information, from the internet and many other places, but they don't know what to do with that information because information is not the clue to knowledge. It's the prescience that you know what you are looking for. And that has a lot to do with the heart.
Well, thank you for that, Helga. And I'd like to conclude by just asking you what you think people can do to participate with us tomorrow in the International Day of Peace.
Well, there are many peace demonstrations in many places around the world because it is the UN International Peace Day. If check at the newspapers or internet, if there is a demonstration nearby where you are, absolutely go there. Go to meet up with the people demonstrating for peace because it is. World peace is right now the most important matter, because if you don't have peace, there will be nothing. We are very close to that. If you can't find anybody close to where you are demonstrating, and this you should do in any case, get in touch with the Schiller Institute. Contact us, have contact with us, and we find a way. You can do a lot of things. You can visit your local politician. You can write letters to editors. You can, there are many, many things. And I think the most important is that you make that step and become indignated. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, that you become upset about the condition of the world and you don't let it go because you can be part of what makes it better.
I think the word you're looking for is indignant, but I think people understand what you mean. So Helga, thanks for joining us today, and hopefully many of our viewers will be involved with us tomorrow with the Day of Peace. See you next week.
Till next week.